Lin Wei felt the sound before he saw it. He had always been able to hear things others couldn't too much, sometimes. It wasn't like some supernatural sense, it was more of an overwhelming connection to the frequencies around him. But now, after the accident, after the experiment, the sound took on a life of its own. It was no longer just something he heard. It was something he could see. Today, it was the sound of a scream. It came from down the alley to his right, a sharp, high-pitched cry of panic that slashed through the air. Lin's eyes flicked toward it, but it wasn't the figure at the mouth of the alley he focused on, it was the sound itself. He saw it first as a ripple, distorting the air, bending the space around it like heat waves. Then, like a ribbon caught in a windstorm, it twisted, sending out concentric circles that expanded outward, pulsating and vibrating. The scream itself didn't matter, not yet. What mattered was the pattern of the sound, its shape, its velocity, its trajectory. It told him everything he needed to know. Lin snapped his attention back to the alley. There, standing with his back to the wall, was the cause of the scream, a man with a gun, pointing it at a young woman in the shadows. In that moment, Lin knew exactly how to move. He surged forward, darting across the rooftops with the precision of a panther. Every step he took was guided by the invisible ripples of sound he saw hanging in the air. The sound of the woman's desperate breaths. The pulse of her heartbeat, racing in time with the threat. The faint hum of the gun's metal, vibrating slightly from the man's hand. The criminal didn't see him coming. Lin's vision of sound wrapped around him like a shroud, predicting his every movement. When the man raised the gun to fire, Lin had already calculated the trajectory of the bullet before it left the barrel. With a blur of motion, Lin dove, his body angled perfectly, the arc of his jump timed precisely with the moment the man pulled the trigger. The bullet flew past Lin's face, missing by inches. He landed softly behind the gunman, his fists driving into the man's ribs before he even had time to react. The impact was like a hammer, the force magnified by the precision of Lin's strike. The man crumpled, gasping for air as Lin twisted his arm behind his back, disarming him with a single motion. The sound of the woman's breathing calmed. Lin turned to her, offering a quick, reassuring smile. She stared at him, wide-eyed, not sure whether to be relieved or terrified. He understood. Few people ever got used to his abilities. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice low. The woman nodded, still in shock. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, as if wondering what sort of person was capable of moving like that. Lin didn't stick around. He could hear sirens approaching in the distance, the growing hum of police radios blending with the fading echoes of his encounter. Time to vanish. Just like always, Lin Wei wasn't a hero. Not in the traditional sense. He didn't wear a cape, didn't pose for the cameras. He was a vigilante, a shadow in the streets of a city too tangled in corruption to save itself. His gift was both a blessing and a curse. Seeing sound was not something people understood, not even him. When it first happened, when the accident changed him, it felt like the world had exploded into 1,000 new pieces. Everything that made sound became something visible. Every footstep, every heartbeat, every car engine, they weren't just noises anymore. They were shapes, colors, patterns. It was like seeing the skeleton of the world, laid bare. The trick was learning to interpret it. First, Lin had stumbled, missing strikes, misjudging the speed of objects, even getting disoriented by the overwhelming flood of sensory input. But over time, he'd learned to navigate the chaos, bending it to his will. He wasn't just seeing the shapes, he could predict them, see the pattern of movement, trace it in real time. It made him nearly untouchable in a fight, but that was also the problem. He was untouchable in a fight, but he was always alone. His gift made people uncomfortable, as if they couldn't trust him, or worse, that they didn't want to. It wasn't the power itself that scared them, but the way it made him different. Lin had tried to connect with people. He had tried to live a normal life, but the noise in his head, literal and metaphorical, was too much to ignore. So he retreated. Into the shadows. Into the streets. Into the silence that only his gift could bring him. Tonight, though, the silence wasn't enough. Lin stood on the rooftop, watching the city stretch below him. It was a blur of lights and sound, a cacophony of life that never stopped. And yet, for all its noise, Lin felt something deeper, something darker. He had fought in these streets for years, and nothing had changed. He could see the patterns in the chaos, but he couldn't fix them. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his reverie. He pulled it out, seeing the name on the screen, Dr. He. It had been months since he'd heard from Dr. He, the one person who might know something about the accident that had given him his gift. Lin had spent years trying to track him down, but Dr. He had always been elusive, living off the grid, constantly moving. This was the first time he had contacted Lin in a long while. Lin answered immediately. Dr. He. Lin, Dr. He's voice crackled through the phone. I know what you're thinking. And you're not wrong. Lin frowned. What do you mean? I've been tracking the group that's been developing countermeasures to your ability. They're getting closer. And they know about you. Lin felt a jolt of fear cut through him. He had suspected something like this for a while. The criminals in the city had always been more organized than they appeared, smarter, more advanced. It had crossed his mind that his power might one day be exploited. But hearing it from Dr. He, it made the reality hit harder. What do they want? Lin asked. They want to reverse engineer your ability. Make it a weapon, Dr. He said. But it's not just about you anymore. They're creating something bigger. Something worse. You're not just a target. You're a key. Lin's mind raced. He had spent years refining his abilities, learning how to use them in battle, but he had never once considered that they might be used against him, or that his very gift could be twisted into something that could destroy him. Where do I go? Lin asked. I'll send you the location. But be careful. This group, they're not like the others you've faced. They're smarter. More dangerous. The next few days passed in a blur for Lin. He hunted down leads, chased down whispers in dark corners of the city, and avoided the growing eyes of surveillance drones. He could feel the pressure mounting, the danger closing in on him from all sides. Then, one evening, he met his first real sign of the enemy. It was an ambush. Lin had been tracking a lead to a secluded warehouse near the edge of the city. The place reeked of secrecy, the air thick with the hum of machinery. He approached cautiously, every step guided by the sound of his surroundings. The pulse of distant footsteps. The clicking of keyboards. The low hum of machinery. Suddenly, it hit him. The sound of the footsteps, the movement had changed. He saw it, a flicker in the usual pattern. It was subtle, but it was there. Someone had noticed him. The trap had been set. Before he could react, the first wave of mercenaries burst from the shadows. But Lin was ready. He could hear their breath, feel the pattern of their movements as they surged toward him. He twisted his body mid-air, dodging the first bullet, rolling into a crouch. But the sound was different now. The patterns weren't as clear. His vision, his sense was being distorted, twisted. A new force had entered the field. A cold dread crept up Lin's spine. They had done it. They had cracked it. Lin felt it the moment the sound around him started to warp. There was no mistaking it. He had honed his senses too well over the years to ignore the subtle distortion. It was like a layer of static, a fuzz that smudged the sharp lines of the world he was so used to seeing. The air vibrated with a foreign hum, one that didn't belong. He dove to the left instinctively as the first mercenary's bullet whizzed past him, grazing the edge of his jacket. He hadn't seen the attack coming, not in the way he normally would have. The trajectory of the bullet had been distorted, as if the very fabric of the sound waves had been bent. He landed hard on his shoulder, the impact shaking through his body, but he was already up, his mind racing to adjust. The sound shifted again, twisting in the air like a slithering thing. Lin could hear their footsteps now, too close, too many. He knew they were trying to corner him, trying to trap him in a way he couldn't predict. He had to move. Before they could close the gap, Lin launched himself into the air, his legs pushing off the ground with a strength born of years of practice. But this time, his vision of the world was incomplete, fractured. He saw the flickering echoes of the sound waves, but the clarity he relied on was gone. Every movement, every breath felt muffled, like watching shadows through a foggy window. It was like trying to fight with one hand tied behind his back, except his hands were tied in 1,000 ways. He reached for the wall to push himself higher, but the sound didn't guide him as it normally did. He had to guess where the next threat was coming from, calculate their patterns based on intuition alone, and that was something he was never truly comfortable doing. A bullet slammed into the wall just behind him, splintering concrete. Lin's head snapped to the side, heart racing, adrenaline spiking. Another shot rang out, but this time, he was ready. He dodged, twisting his body out of the path of the bullet as it passed mere inches from his ear. The sound of the gunshot was distorted, too flattened, like someone had pressed pause on the world. It was like being trapped in a half-dream, unable to trust anything his senses told him, and then, from the corner of his vision, he saw it. A shadow moved faster than his mind could process, and before Lin could react, he felt a sudden, jarring blow to his side. The force knocked him sideways, and for a second, everything went black. His body slammed into the ground, the concrete scraping his skin, but it wasn't the pain that made him panic. It was the absence of sound. The absence of clarity. He pushed himself up, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to catch his breath. His vision of sound flickered, unstable, like a broken signal. There was something here, a new presence, something that had the power to throw off his perception of the world. The mercenaries were closing in, moving with a precision that only comes from careful planning. Lin's mind raced, his senses scrambled to make sense of the chaos. There was too much noise, too much interference. He could hear the distant hum of machinery, the soft tap of boots on concrete, but it was all wrong. It was all twisted. Then he heard something else. A faint hum, a frequency that was out of place. It was coming from above. Lin's eyes shot upward, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he caught a glimpse of the source, a small drone, hovering silently, its sensors aimed directly at him. It wasn't just watching him, it was disrupting his ability to hear. The drone was emitting a sound wave that blurred the very air around it, drowning out the frequencies Lin relied on to make sense of the world. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. These people had developed a countermeasure, something designed to mess with his ability. They had figured out a way to hack the one advantage he had over them. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just a fight anymore, it was survival. Lin's hand shot to his side, instinctively reaching for the small knife hidden in his belt. He needed to get close, needed to take out the drone before it could fully incapacitate him. But as he started to move, the world around him seemed to crackle and shift. The sound of his own breathing, the soft thud of his footsteps, everything was a blur, a swirling mass of confusion. He couldn't focus. Another strike landed. This time, the blow came from behind, a fist crashing into his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. His body spasmed, pain shooting up his side, but Lin didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. He spun, bringing his knee up into his attacker's stomach, driving him back. The sound of the man's staggered breath told Lin where he was, even though his vision was still a tangle of flickering noise. Lin's senses were reeling, but there was no time to waste. He had to move, had to break free from the suffocating fog of interference that was clouding his mind. He pushed off the ground, taking a leap toward the nearest wall. His feet hit the surface, and he launched himself into the air once more. His body was heavy, sluggish, weighed down by the distortion, but he fought against it, focusing on the one thing he could still control, his motion. He twisted in midair, reaching out with his arm to grab the edge of a ledge, and with a final burst of energy, he hauled himself up onto the rooftop. For a moment, the world around him settled. The interference was still there, buzzing in the background, but it was quieter. He could think again. Lin crouched low, his body tense as he surveyed the scene below. The mercenaries had spread out, surrounding the area. The drone was still hovering above, its quiet hum filling the air. It was a constant, invisible threat, one he couldn't escape, not without neutralizing it, and then, through the fog of distortion, Lin heard something else. Something he hadn't expected. A voice that it was soft, but unmistakable. "Lin Wei," the voice called, the words cutting through the haze like a blade. "We know what you are. We know what you can do." Lin's pulse skipped a beat. The voice was calm, too calm, and yet it held a certainty. The voice belonged to someone who knew him, someone who had been watching him for a long time. For a split second, Lin felt his world tilt, like the ground beneath him was shifting. This wasn't just a random group of mercenaries anymore. This was something more organized. Something personal. "I don't want to kill you," the voice continued. "But I will if you don't stop. You're in over your head." Lin's mind raced. In over my head? He had spent years perfecting his skills, mastering the ability to see and manipulate sound. No one knew the power of sound better than he did. But even as the voice spoke, he realized something. He might have underestimated them. He might have underestimated just how far they were willing to go to stop him. The next sound he heard was the sharp, mechanical click of a gun's safety being switched off. The world around him snapped back into focus, the crackling static fading just enough for him to see his attackers again, this time, standing in full force. Lin's body tensed. He had to move, now. His breath caught in his throat as the world around him exploded into motion. The drone hummed, the mercenaries shifted, and Lin made his decision. Lin didn't hesitate. He had no choice but to act. He couldn't afford to lose any more time, not when they had already anticipated his every move. The drone's humming grew louder, like the buzz of an insect circling just out of reach. Lin's senses screamed at him, every flicker of the air, every pulse of sound that vibrated through his body, but it was all distorted, fractured. The world was too broken. His gift was being sabotaged, and for the first time in years, he felt truly vulnerable, but vulnerability wasn't an option. Not when lives were at stake. The sound of the gun's safety being disengaged was followed by the sharp exhale of one of the mercenaries, a sound that Lin locked onto instantly. He twisted his body, preparing for the next strike, his muscles coiling like a spring. He pushed himself into motion just as the first bullet shattered the air. He could hear it, the path of the bullet, its trajectory, but it was disjointed. Not the clean line he was used to, but a jagged, chaotic arc, like a signal being scrambled. Still, it was enough. Lin ducked, the bullet missing him by a fraction, grazing his jacket as it zipped past. The second shot came quicker, almost too fast to follow, but Lin had learned to trust his instincts when his powers failed him. He let the sound guide him, not through the perfect clarity he was accustomed to, but through the raw, unrefined edges of the chaos. It was messy, but it worked. He dropped to the ground just in time, the bullet slamming into the concrete next to him, kicking up dust and fragments. The third shot missed as well, though it was only by luck, his body already in motion, rolling to the side to avoid it. Lin scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, and the world around him seemed to pulse in time with his racing pulse. The mercenaries weren't just shooting, they were coordinating. They were moving together. Too well. He needed to finish this. He pushed forward, but it was like trying to move through thick smoke. His body moved through a haze of interference, every movement uncertain. The hum of the drone, the footsteps of the mercenaries, everything was jumbled together, a disorienting web of sound. The walls of the building around him felt like they were closing in, the echo of every motion amplifying as if 100 different events were happening at once. Then, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. He didn't hear the man behind him until it was too late. A strong hand gripped his shoulder, spinning him around. Lin reacted immediately, his elbow driving back into the man's ribs, but the mercenary was prepared, locking his arm in place, forcing Lin into a grapple. For a moment, Lin struggled, trying to get a clear reading of the attacker's movement, but the interference was too much. He couldn't hear the heartbeat or the breath of his opponent as he normally would, couldn't gauge the weight of the man's body, or predict his next move. The mercenary had closed the distance too quickly. He was just a blur of sound, a chaotic mass Lin couldn't untangle. A fist slammed into Lin's jaw. The force of it was enough to rattle him, to disorient him, but it wasn't the blow itself that left Lin shaken, it was the sound of it. The absence of sound that followed it. He could barely make out the faint hum of his attacker's breath, but it was nearly drowned out by the screeching whine of the drone above, filling the air with a high-pitched buzz. Lin gritted his teeth. His powers were slipping away. He wasn't fighting just one enemy now, he was fighting his own inability to perceive. His every move felt like he was fighting blindfolded. This wasn't a fight of muscle or reflex anymore. It was a race to find the clarity that had once come so easily, to regain control of the battlefield that was slipping through his fingers. With a savage growl, Lin twisted his body, pushing his legs back against the mercenary's chest and flipping himself into the air. The man's grip faltered, and Lin took his chance, kicking out, his foot connecting with the mercenary's stomach with brutal force. The mercenary staggered back, gasping for air, but before Lin could capitalize on the opening, another assailant appeared from the corner of his vision. Lin's heart thudded in his chest. Too many. The others were closing in. The sound of their footsteps, the slight whisper of their clothing against the wind, it was all too much, all too scrambled. There was a pulse of clarity, a flicker in the chaos. Lin's eyes snapped to the drone. He knew what had to be done. He couldn't take them all down, not with his abilities in this state. But he could take down the source of his weakness. The drone. It was the key. If he could silence it, if he could return the world to some semblance of order, he might have a fighting chance. His gaze locked on the small device hovering just above the rooftop, its sensors scanning the area, its frequency washing over him like an invisible tide. Lin's body moved on instinct. He sprinted, his feet pounding against the rooftop, his senses stretched thin as he bolted toward the drone. He could feel the rush of air as he moved, the sounds of the mercenary's pursuit fading slightly in his mind as his focus narrowed to one point: the drone. The world around him flared into motion as he sprinted forward. Every sound was a blur, but the buzzing of the drone stood out, filling his vision, distorting it. He ignored the mess of frequencies, trusting only his body, only his drive. He pushed forward, ignoring the twist of pain in his side as he closed the distance. A shot rang out, the bullet missing him by inches, but Lin barely felt it. His mind had already reached the drone. His hand shot out, grabbing the edge of a metal vent on the rooftop and pulling himself up. With a final leap, he swung himself onto the flat surface of the drone. The device whined, its sensors pivoting, tracking his movements, but it was too slow. Lin brought his foot down hard on the casing, cracking it open. The drone's interference surged for a moment, but Lin didn't hesitate. He reached into the exposed circuits, his hand a blur as he yanked the wires apart. The frequency shifted, the hum of the drone screeching as it lost power. The sound of its interference began to fade. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world around him began to stabilize. The buzzing of the drone dulled, the mercenary's movements sharpened, and Lin's mind snapped into focus. The clarity he had long relied on rushed back like a flood, the patterns of sound around him reappearing with perfect precision. He could hear them now. Their breaths. Their footsteps. Their heartbeats. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, Lin could see it again. He took a deep breath and dropped to the ground, landing softly in a crouch. The first mercenary was closing in fast, but Lin saw it coming before the man even had time to adjust his grip on his weapon. The sound of the gunshot was crisp and clear. Lin moved, his body responding instinctively, his vision tracking the arc of the bullet before it even left the barrel. He sidestepped, felt the wind of the bullet pass by his ear, and in the same fluid motion, his fist collided with the mercenary's throat. The man collapsed instantly, gasping for air, his body crumpling to the ground. Two more mercenaries approached from the left. Lin saw their footsteps, knew their plan before they did. One of them reached for his gun, but Lin was faster. He spun to the side, a blur of motion, and before the man could react, Lin's foot connected with his chest, sending him crashing into the rooftop railing. The third man, larger, bulkier, advanced with a growl, but Lin didn't flinch. He wasn't seeing sound anymore. He wasn't hearing it. He was the sound. The world pulsed with his movement, the sharp clarity of each strike reverberating through the air. He dropped low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him, and in a single, fluid motion, drove his knee into the mercenary's chest. It was over. The rooftop fell silent, save for the distant hum of the city below. Lin stood, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His senses were raw, but they were his again. The distortion was gone. The interference had faded. He looked at the mercenaries lying on the ground, unable to suppress the flicker of satisfaction that passed through him, but that flicker quickly faded as his mind returned to the bigger picture. There was someone behind this. Someone who had orchestrated this entire mess. Someone who knew about him, who knew how to make him bleed, and they were coming for him.